He has ordered men buried without blinking, built an empire on blood, silence, and the kind of fear that makes grown men lose sleep. Marco Valenti does not feel, does not hesitate, does not lose. Until tonight. One photo, one deleted message, one face he swore he buried 10 months ago, and a newborn baby with his eyes. The most dangerous man on the West Coast just had his world ripped open by a 5-pound secret he never knew existed. What happens next will destroy everything he built, and everything he thought he was. Follow this story to the end. Hit like. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The rain came in sideways off the sound, the kind that didn't fall so much as attack, horizontal sheets of it slamming the floor-to-ceiling glass of the 43rd floor like the city itself had something to prove. Seattle did that. It didn't warn you. It just hit. Marco Valenti stood at the window with a glass of scotch. He hadn't touched in 20 minutes, watching the lights below blur and bleed through the water. From up here, the city looked clean, ordered, every light in its place, every street running where it was supposed to run. From up here, you could almost believe the world made sense. He knew better. The penthouse was quiet in the way expensive things were always quiet, insulated, sealed, engineered to keep the outside world exactly where it belonged. The furniture was dark leather and cold stone. No photographs on the walls. No softness anywhere. The space looked like what it was, the headquarters of a man who had stripped his life down to function, to precision, to the elimination of anything that couldn't be controlled or used. His phone was on the kitchen island behind him. He hadn't looked at it in 6 minutes. He knew because the clock on the opposite wall had been the only thing moving in this room since his last call ended, and he'd been counting the seconds without meaning to, the way you count things when your body knows something is wrong before your mind catches up. He turned, picked up the phone. The message was from a number he didn't recognize, no name attached, just a number with a Seattle area code, and a single image that had loaded before he could decide whether to open it. Elena. She was standing in what looked like a hospital room. The light was that particular flat white of fluorescent tubes over linoleum, the kind of light that makes everyone look exhausted and real and stripped of any pretense. She was wearing a gray sweater, no makeup, hair pulled back in the loose way she used to wear it when she was off duty, when she was just herself and not the version of herself she showed to courtrooms. She was looking down at something in her arms. A baby. Newborn small. Wrapped in a striped hospital blanket, the kind they used in every maternity ward in every hospital in the country, that particular institutional pattern that meant new life and terror in equal measure. The message below the image read, "My little miracle," and then the image was gone, deleted. The notification vanished as if it had never existed. The number disappeared from his call log a second later. A clean wipe, automated, the kind of thing someone set up in advance. Someone who knew how these things worked. Someone who had thought about this and then changed their mind, or panicked, or hit send by accident and then tried to undo it. Too late. Marco stood in his kitchen holding his phone and felt something move through his chest that he had not felt in years. Not fear exactly. Not grief. Something older than both of those things. Something that lived below language. The baby. He had seen the image for maybe 4 seconds. Less. But he'd spent the last decade training himself to absorb and retain visual information under pressure, faces, layouts, threat assessments, and his mind had already filed it away in complete detail without his permission. The baby's face, the shape of the jaw, the particular set of the brow even in sleep, even in those compressed newborn features that people always said all looked the same. They didn't all look the same. He knew that face. He'd seen it in mirrors his entire life. Marco set his phone down on the counter with a control that cost him more than any business decision he'd made in the last 3 years. He pressed both palms flat against the cold stone and stood there, breathing. Just breathing. The rain hit the glass. The clock counted seconds. Somewhere far below, the city moved through its night without knowing anything had just changed. He picked up the phone again, pulled up his contact for Nico Reyes, his head of security, a man who had been with him since the beginning of all of this, who knew where every body was buried because he'd helped bury most of them. Nico answered on the second ring. "Boss, I need a location." Marco's voice came out the way it always did. Level, unhurried, The voice of a man who had learned that volume was for people who weren't sure they'd be obeyed. Elena Marlowe. She was a civil rights attorney based in Seattle. I need her current address, her workplace, where she goes on Tuesdays. Whatever you can get me in the next hour. Silence on the other end. Not hesitation. Nico didn't hesitate. Just the slight recalibration of a man who recognized a name he hadn't heard in a long time and was smart enough not to comment on it. 1 hour, Nico said. Marco ended the call. He stood there another minute looking at the rain. Then he went to the coat rack by the elevator, pulled on his jacket, and left the scotch exactly where it was. 10 months. He had not said her name out loud in 10 months, had not allowed himself to think it in anything more than the most peripheral way. The way you don't look directly at something bright because you know what it'll do to your vision. He'd been deliberate about it, surgical. He'd taken the part of his mind that held Elena Marlowe, and he'd closed a door on it, and he'd put everything he had into not opening it again. He'd been mostly successful. Mostly. There were nights, not many, but enough, when the control slipped. When he'd be in a meeting or in the back of a car moving through the city, and something small and irrelevant would snag on a memory. The smell of coffee mixed with cold air, the particular cadence of an argument conducted by someone who was absolutely certain they were right, the way late afternoon light fell across a conference table. Small things, civilian things, things that shouldn't have the power to stop a man like him cold. They did anyway. He had met Elena Marlowe 14 months ago during a legal dispute involving a real estate holding company, one of his legitimate fronts, a property development firm called Cascadia Partners, that held title to 14 commercial buildings across the Pacific Northwest. The dispute was routine in theory, a lease violation claim brought by a nonprofit that had been renting space in one of his Belltown properties. The nonprofit was small. The claim was nuisance level. His attorneys had told him it would be resolved in 30 days. It was not resolved in 30 days, because the nonprofit had retained Elena Marlowe. He'd read her file before the first hearing. 34 years old. Harvard Law. Top of her class. 5 years at a mid-sized litigation firm before she went independent. Specialized in civil rights, tenant protections, and what her website called systemic accountability, which was a polished way of saying she spent her professional life going after powerful institutions and making them wish she hadn't. Her record was remarkable. Not because she won every case, nobody won every case, but because the cases she took were the ones other attorneys looked at and quietly declined. The ones where the power differential was so extreme that winning seemed structurally impossible. And she took them anyway and forced the powerful party to work harder than they wanted to. She had made his attorneys work very hard. The first time he saw her in person, she was standing at the plaintiff's table in a King County courtroom, speaking to the judge in a voice that carried absolute conviction without ever rising above a conversational register. She was wearing a dark suit that was professional without being expensive. She didn't dress like someone performing authority. She dressed like someone who already had it and didn't need to announce it. Her hair was down. She had a yellow legal pad in her left hand covered in handwritten notes. She was making an argument about displacement and economic coercion and the systemic use of lease violation claims to pressure nonprofit tenants out of gentrifying neighborhoods. The argument was precise, well-sourced, and directly implicated Cascadia Partners in a pattern of behavior that went well beyond the specific lease in question. She wasn't just fighting the case in front of her. She was constructing the broader case she intended to make if his people didn't settle. Marco sat in the gallery and watched her and thought, there she is, the problem. He was right about that. He just got the nature of the problem wrong. His driver, a young man named Carver, who spoke rarely and drove exceptionally, was waiting in the underground garage when Marco came down. No call, no instruction. Carver had been watching the building's elevator feed and had the car running before Marco reached the ground floor. That kind of attention to habit was why Carver was still employed. Seattle Grace, Marco said, getting in. Carver didn't ask questions. The drive from First Hill to the hospital took 11 minutes in the rain-slicked night traffic. Marco sat in the back and looked at his phone, not at the deleted message, which was gone, but at the blank screen, the dark glass reflecting his own face back at him. He looked the way he always looked, composed, unreadable, the expression of a man whose face had been trained over years to reveal exactly nothing. He was not composed. His mind was running the math he didn't want to run. The calendar calculation that kept producing the same result no matter how many times he tried to find an error in it. 14 months since they met. 12 months since things became what they became. 10 months since it ended, badly, finally, in a conversation he'd replayed more times than he was willing to admit. In the penthouse he'd since had redecorated so the specific geometry of that night no longer existed in the room. 10 months. A newborn, in a hospital, tonight. The math was not complicated. He pressed the heel of his hand against his sternum, hard, the way you pressed on something that hurt to confirm it was still there, and stared out the window at the wet city sliding past. Seattle Grace Hospital rose up out of the rain like a monument to controlled emergency. All lit glass and signage, and the organized urgency of a place where people arrived broken and were expected to leave otherwise. Marco had Carver park on the street half a block north, in the shadow between two streetlights, and he walked to the hospital alone. The lobby was the usual organized chaos of a Tuesday night in a major urban medical center. A family clustered near the reception desk, a man in scrubs moving fast with a tablet, an older woman sitting in a chair near the window with a bag on her lap, and the particular stillness of someone who had been waiting a long time and had stopped expecting the wait to end soon. The fluorescent light was exactly as flat and honest as it had looked in the photograph. Marco moved through the lobby without stopping. He'd spent enough time in environments that required controlled movement. Board meetings, negotiation rooms, situations where showing uncertainty meant losing ground. That he could navigate almost any space without looking like he was lost, even when he was. He found the directory on the wall near the elevator bank, scanned it once, and took the elevator to the 4th floor. The maternity ward. He knew before he pressed the button that this was where he was going. The photograph had told him enough. The hospital had told him the rest the moment he'd identified which facility it was. Seattle Grace had the highest-rated neonatal intensive care unit in the Pacific Northwest. The place doctors sent complicated pregnancies and difficult deliveries. The place parents went when the standard answers weren't enough. Complications. He stood in the elevator and kept his face still and thought about that word and what it meant about the last 10 months. About what had been happening in the parts of the world he hadn't been watching. The 4th floor corridor was quieter than the lobby. Softer lighting. The sounds here were different. Lower. More intimate. The particular hush of a place built around the presence of very new life and the complicated emotions that came with it. A nurse passed him without looking up from a chart. He fell in behind her at a distance, following the signs toward the neonatal wing. And then he saw her. Elena was walking away from him, down the corridor to his left, maybe 40 feet ahead. He recognized her before he saw her face, the way she moved, the particular set of her shoulders, the stride that was always slightly faster than the situation seemed to require, because she always had somewhere to be and something to prove when she got there. She was wearing the gray sweater from the photograph. She had a paper coffee cup in her right hand. She turned left through a set of double doors marked Neonatal ICU, authorized personnel only. Marco stopped in the middle of the corridor. His heart was doing something it had no business doing, something irregular and uncontrolled and completely incompatible with the version of himself he'd been maintaining for the last decade. He stood there and breathed and looked at the doors where she'd disappeared and understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, that whatever happened next was going to be irreversible. He could leave. He was aware of that option. He could turn around, take the elevator back to the lobby, get in the car with Carver, return to the penthouse, and spend the next week deciding whether the image he'd seen for 4 seconds actually meant what his body was telling him it meant. He could be methodical. He could gather information through his people before he made any contact. That was the rational approach. That was how he handled every other high-stakes situation he'd ever encountered. He walked to the double doors and pushed through them. The neonatal intensive care unit was a room designed around glass and precision and the very particular kind of hope that requires mechanical assistance. Incubators in rows, each one occupied, each one attended by the soft hum of monitoring equipment and the occasional soft chime of an alert. The lighting was dimmer in here, more careful, as if someone had understood that the smallest patients deserved a gentler introduction to the world they'd arrived in ahead of schedule. Marco stood just inside the door and scanned the room the way he scanned every room. Exits, occupants, sight lines, threats. And then he stopped scanning because he found what he was looking for. Elena was standing at the far end of the row, third incubator from the wall. Her back was to the door. She had set her coffee cup down on a small table beside her, and she was leaning forward with both hands pressed against the glass, looking in, and the stillness of her posture was unlike anything he'd ever seen from her. Elena in motion was compelling. Elena at rest was devastating. He walked toward her. He was 6 feet away when she sensed something. He saw it in the slight change of tension across her shoulders, the almost imperceptible shift of a person's body when it registers a presence it wasn't expecting. She didn't turn immediately. She stayed facing the incubator for another 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds he watched her hand press harder against the glass, and he understood that she was steadying herself. She turned. Her eyes found him immediately. For a moment, a full, silent, unreasonable moment, neither of them said anything. The monitoring equipment continued its soft electronic conversation. Somewhere in the row, a baby made a small, searching sound and quieted again. The light hummed. The rain was inaudible up here, insulated away, and the world outside had temporarily ceased to matter. Elena's face did something complicated. It moved through several expressions quickly. Shock, then something close to fear, then the compression of both into the controlled blankness she'd learned to wear when she was in rooms where she couldn't afford to show weakness. He knew that face. He'd watched her put it on in courtrooms, in conference rooms, in conversations that required her to hold her ground against people with more power and more resources than she had. She'd worn it at him before. She was wearing it now. "Marco," she said. One word. His name. In her voice, which he had not heard in 10 months, and which did exactly what he'd known it would do the moment he allowed himself to hear it. Elena. He looked at her, then past her, at the incubator, at the baby inside it, small, monitored, sleeping with that absolute totality that only the very new possessed. At the face. His face. He looked back at her. "Tell me," he said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a demand. It was just 2 words that meant, "I already know. Say it out loud so we can begin whatever this is." Elena closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. When she opened them, the controlled blankness was still there, but something had shifted underneath it. Something older, heavier, the look of a person who had been carrying something alone for a very long time and had just arrived at the moment where that was no longer possible. "His name is Noah," she said. The room kept humming. "He's 5 months old," she continued, her voice steady with the effort of a woman who had learned to conduct herself under pressure and was now applying that skill to the hardest sentence she'd ever had to say. "He was born 7 weeks early. There were complications. He spent his first 8 weeks in this unit." She paused. "He's doing well now. The doctors expect him to be completely healthy." Marco looked at his son. 5 months? 7 weeks early. 8 weeks in this room, in this glass box, attached to these machines. 5 months of a life happening in the world, while Marco Valenti ran his empire on the other side of the city and didn't know any of it existed. "Why didn't you tell me what?" he said. It wasn't an accusation. Not yet. It was a genuine question. The only question that mattered at this moment. The question that the rest of everything would have to be built on or around. Elena looked at him with something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite guilt, and was probably something that didn't have a clean name. "I tried," she said. And then a sound in the corridor, a nurse's voice, approaching, and Elena reached out and wrapped her hand around his forearm and pulled him to the left, through a side door, into a small family waiting room that was empty at this hour. 4 chairs, a low table. A window with the blinds half drawn against the rain-dark night. The door swung closed behind them. They stood 3 feet apart in the flat hospital light, and 10 months of silence sat between them like a third person in the room. So, the waiting room smelled like recycled air and old coffee, and the particular exhaustion of people who spent their nights here. Marco stood with his arms at his sides and his jaw tight and looked at Elena and waited for her to say the thing that came after "I tried." She didn't make him wait long. "The first time was 2 days after I found out," she said. "I called the penthouse line. Whoever answered told me you were unavailable and took a message." She paused. "I didn't hear back. I never got that message." "I know that now." Her voice was controlled, but there was an edge underneath it. Not performance, not positioning, just the honest residue of months of something difficult. "I called again 3 weeks later. Different number. A man answered who told me you were in Vancouver and would be unreachable for the next 10 days. There was a situation in Vancouver. He remembered it. A distribution dispute that had nearly turned into something uglier. My communications were restricted. I didn't know that. She moved to the window, not looking at him, looking at the rain-smeared glass. I tried twice more after that. One call went to voicemail. One was answered and then disconnected. She turned back. And then I stopped trying. He stood there and absorbed this. The thing about it, the thing that made it hard to find solid ground under the anger he could feel starting to build, was that all of it was completely plausible. He knew how his operation ran. He knew how many layers of personnel and protocol stood between the outside world and his direct attention. He knew there were periods, particularly during the Vancouver crisis and the power struggle that followed it, when messages had gone undelivered. When his people had made judgment calls about what warranted his attention and what didn't. When a call from a woman he'd separated from would not have been flagged as urgent. He knew all of that. It didn't make it easier. You could have come in person, he said. Her head turned. The look she gave him was the one she'd perfected over years of dealing with powerful men who said things that were technically logical but missed the entire point. Come in person, she repeated. Yes, Marco. She said his name the way she used to in arguments, not as punctuation, as emphasis, as I need you to understand what you're actually asking. I was pregnant and scared, and the father was a man who runs the largest criminal syndicate on the West Coast. She let that sit. Coming to you in person, in that building, with that information, I wasn't going to do that. I wasn't going to bring a pregnancy into that world, not without knowing what your response was going to be. He didn't answer that. Not because he had no answer, but because the honest answer was not a simple one, and they both knew it. So you decided alone, he said. I didn't decide anything, she said, and for the first time the control cracked slightly, just enough to show the exhaustion underneath. I decided to have my son. I decided to protect him. Everything else was just surviving. The rain hit the window. The building held its breath around them. Marco looked at her and thought about the last 10 months from her side of them. The calls that went nowhere. The decision to stop making them. The pregnancy alone. The early delivery. The 8 weeks in the NICU. The 5 months since. He thought about what it cost a person to carry all of that without anyone to share it with. The particular kind of loneliness that came from having a secret that was also a life. He thought about who Elena Marlowe was. She was not a woman who made decisions out of spite or malice. She was not strategic in the petty sense. She was strategic in the deep sense. The sense of a person who looked at the landscape of a situation and calculated survival. She had done what she'd calculated she needed to do to survive, and to give her son a chance to survive. He couldn't call that wrong. He wanted to. Standing in a hospital waiting room 10 months after the worst conversation of his adult life, learning that his son had existed for 5 months without his knowledge, he very much wanted to find something to call wrong. But he knew her. Even after 10 months of deliberate distance, he knew her, and the thing he knew most fundamentally about Elena Marlowe was that she did not lie to protect herself. She told hard truths at high cost. It was the quality that had made her exceptional at her work and nearly impossible to be in a relationship with. The message tonight, he said. The photograph. You sent it. She didn't deny it. She turned back to the window. It was an accident, she said after a moment. An accident. I was talking to my sister. I was showing her a photo and I misdirected it to you. A pause. I deleted it as fast as I could. Not fast enough. No. She was quiet. Not fast enough. He walked to the window and stood beside her, not touching, looking out at the rain and the wet rooftops of the city below. From here, the view was nothing like the view from his penthouse. This was closer, ground level almost, the city at human scale. Individual lights in individual windows, individual lives behind each one. The ordinary texture of a world he'd spent 20 years looking at from a distance. Can I see him? Marco asked. Elena didn't answer immediately. When he turned to look at her, she was looking at him, not performing a legal assessment, not calculating an outcome. Just looking at him the way she used to in the early months, before things got complicated, like he was a problem she found genuinely interesting. He's sleeping, she said finally. I know. Another silence. Yes, she said. Tumta. They went back through the door together. The neonatal ICU was exactly as they'd left it. The hum, the light, the particular sacred quiet of the room. They walked to the incubator at the far end of the row, and Marco stood in front of it and looked at his son for the first time in any real sense, the first time he was actually present for it, conscious and deliberate and fully there. Noah was sleeping on his back with his arms raised slightly, the way newborns did, the way every human being had once slept before they learned to protect themselves from the world. He was small but not fragile looking. There was something solid about him, something that had already survived and knew it. The monitoring equipment showed all the numbers you'd want to see. His chest rose and fell with the measured regularity of a healthy organism going about the business of existing. He had Elena's mouth. He had Marco's everything else. Marco put one hand against the glass of the incubator and stood there without saying anything. His throat had done something that made speaking temporarily complicated, and he was not a man who performed emotion, so he simply waited until the complication passed. It took longer than he expected. Behind him, Elena stood at a slight distance, not giving him space out of tenderness, but watching him with the careful attention of a person who had not yet decided what she was dealing with. He could feel it. She was doing what she always did, observing, assessing, filing away data about what kind of man she was actually looking at. He was going to have to figure out what kind of man that was. Standing here with his hand against the glass of his son's incubator, with the weight of everything that had happened in the last hour pressing down on the life he'd constructed for himself, Marco Valenti understood with a clarity that left no room for negotiation. The man he'd been before walking into this hospital was not going to be sufficient for what came next. He just didn't know yet what was going to replace him. He lowered his hand from the glass, turned to Elena. She was looking at him with her arms crossed, not defensively, but the way she held herself when she was thinking hard about something. Contained, self-sufficient, the posture of a woman who had spent years being the only reliable person in the room and had structured herself accordingly. "There's something else you need to know," she said. Her voice had changed. The controlled exhaustion was still there, but underneath it was something new, something she'd been holding back since the moment she'd found him standing in the corridor. Something that had been waiting behind all the other things for the right moment to come forward. "His name is David Ashworth," she said. "He's a pediatric cardiologist. We've been seeing each other for the last 3 months." Marco kept his face still. "He knows about Noah. He's been very good with him. He wants—" She stopped, reorganized. "He asked me last week to move in with him, in his house in Medina. He said he wanted to build something with us, something stable." The room hummed around them. Marco looked at her. "And?" he said, "and I haven't given him an answer yet." She met his eyes. "Because 2 days ago I found out you were back in the city, after 6 months away, and then tonight I accidentally sent you that photograph." A pause that contained multitudes. "And now you're here." The monitoring equipment continued its conversation with itself. The rain continued outside, far away and inaudible. A nurse passed behind them without looking. Marco stood in the soft light of the neonatal ICU, looking at the woman who had once told him, in the same penthouse where he'd been standing 3 hours ago, that she could not survive his world, and he thought about what it meant that she had done exactly that. Survived his world, and built something real on the other side of it, something with her son's face and her hands pressed against the glass at midnight. He thought about David Ashworth in his house in Medina, a legitimate man with a legitimate life, offering the kind of stability that Marco had never once been able to promise anyone. He thought about his son, sleeping 3 feet away with his arms raised against a world he was still figuring out. "I'm not going anywhere," Marco said. Elena's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes did. Something small, uncontrolled, honest in the way things were honest when a person was too tired to manage them. "You don't get to decide that," she said. "Not alone." "No," he agreed. "I don't." The silence that followed was different from the silences before. It wasn't hostile and it wasn't comfortable. It was the silence of 2 people standing at the edge of something large, looking at it, not yet willing to say out loud what they both understood was waiting on the other side. Marco put his hand back against the glass. His son kept sleeping, And somewhere in the hospital behind them, his phone buzzed with a message from Nico Reyes containing Elena Marlowe's current address, information he had requested an hour ago, before he knew he was going to walk into this room and find everything he thought he'd locked away still standing exactly where he'd left it, only larger now, only more real. He didn't reach for the phone. He stayed where he was. He stayed until the nurse came to ask them quietly if they needed anything, and Elena said no and gathered her cup and her bag and her careful composure, and they walked out of the neonatal ICU together into the corridor and stood outside the double doors in the flat hallway light, 3 feet apart, everything between them unresolved and enormous and unavoidable. "I'll be back tomorrow," Marco said. Elena looked at him for a long moment. "I know you will," she said, and walked away down the corridor. Marco stood in the hallway and watched her go and understood that the easy part, the part where he didn't know, where there was still the possibility of not knowing, was over. What was coming next was the part where he would have to figure out what he actually was, stripped of the empire that had defined him, stripped of the power that had always been the answer to every question. Standing in a hospital corridor at midnight with the sound of the rain finally audible now through a window at the end of the hall, Marco Valenti understood one thing with absolute certainty. David Ashworth was already in his son's life, and he was running out of time to decide what that meant. He drove back to the penthouse alone. Carver tried to make conversation once, something about the route, about the rain backing up traffic on Madison. And Marco said nothing, and Carver understood, and the rest of the drive passed in the kind of silence that had weight to it, the kind that pressed against the windows from the inside. The scotch was still on the kitchen counter where he'd left it. Marco picked it up, looked at it, and poured it down the sink. He stood at the window again. Same window, same rain, same city, and ran the night through his head the way he ran every problem, systematically, without sentiment, looking for the variables he could control and the ones he couldn't. It was a discipline he'd developed young and refined over 20 years of operating in environments where losing clarity got people killed. Tonight, the discipline wasn't working, because the variables kept collapsing back into a single image. Noah, sleeping in an incubator, arms raised, chest rising and falling with the absolute indifference of a person who had no idea yet what kind of world he'd been born into or who his father was. His father. Marco pressed his forehead against the cold glass and let the city blur below him, and stayed there long enough for the condensation from his breath to fog a small circle on the window. He was not a man given to leaning on things. The physical posture of it felt foreign, almost embarrassing, but there was no one here to see it, and his legs had made the decision without consulting him. He thought about what Elena had said. David Ashworth, pediatric cardiologist, a house in Medina, 3 months. He pulled out his phone and texted Nico. Ashworth, David, cardiologist, Seattle area. Full background, tonight. Nico's response came back in 4 minutes. On it. Marco put the phone down and went to his desk and opened his laptop and stared at a screen full of reports he'd been meaning to review. Distribution numbers, a legal filing from his attorney regarding the Cascadia Partners situation, a message from his man in Portland about a supply chain irregularity that needed resolution. Work. The architecture of the life he'd built, things that had felt 2 hours ago like the entirety of what he was. He closed the laptop without reading any of it. Yeah. He was at the hospital by 8 the next morning. He hadn't slept. He changed clothes and had coffee and sat in his office for 3 hours reading Nico's report on David Ashworth. He's 41 years old, Johns Hopkins medical degree, 7 years at Seattle Children's before joining a private cardiac practice in Bellevue. Clean record. No debt worth mentioning. A man who owned a 4-bedroom house in Medina and a modest sailboat and had, by every available metric, constructed exactly the kind of life that the word stable was invented to describe. No criminal record. No affiliations. No shadows. Marco had read the file twice and found nothing. Not a single thread to pull. Not a single vulnerability to note. And the absence of anything to use had left him with a feeling he wasn't familiar enough with to name cleanly. Something adjacent to inadequacy. Something that sat in his chest the way the scotch should have. He walked into Seattle Grace at 8:03 and took the elevator to the 4th floor and pushed through the double doors into the neonatal ICU, and there was Elena, already there, sitting in a chair beside the incubator with a paper cup of coffee and a book open in her lap that she wasn't reading. She looked up when he came in. She didn't look surprised. "You actually came," she said. "I said I would." She studied him for a moment. The dark circles, the fresh shirt, the set of his jaw. And he watched her read all of it accurately and file it away. "You didn't sleep," she said. "No." She nodded like she'd expected that and looked back at the incubator. Marco pulled a chair from the wall and sat down on the other side of Noah's incubator, across from her. And for a while they just sat there with the baby between them and the monitors doing their quiet work and the morning light coming gray and watery through the high windows. It was almost domestic. The thought landed on him strangely. "He's going to be released next week," Elena said. "The doctors cleared him. His lungs are at full capacity now, and his weight has been consistent." She turned the coffee cup in her hands. "He's ready. Where are you taking him when he's released?" A pause. "My apartment," she said. For now. For now was doing a lot of work in that sentence, and they both knew it. Marco looked at Noah. The baby was awake this morning, eyes open, unfocused, the wide, unfixed gaze of an infant learning to understand the concept of world. He was doing the thing babies did with their hands, the slow opening and closing that looked purposeful but wasn't yet, the body practicing for intentions it would develop later. "Can I?" Marco stopped. Elena looked at him. "There's a rocking chair," she said, nodding toward the corner. "Sometimes they let family members hold him outside the incubator, if you ask the nurse." He didn't ask the nurse. He sat there for another 40 minutes across from Elena, and they talked. Not about David Ashworth, not about the month ahead, or the legal and logistical realities of his existence in Noah's life, not about any of the large impossible things. They talked about small things, the nurse who had been particularly kind during the worst weeks, the specific sound Noah made when he was hungry, a sound Elena described as outraged, the word delivered with something close to affectionate exasperation. The book in her lap, which she'd been trying to finish for 2 months and kept losing her place in because she was too tired to retain anything longer than a paragraph. It was the longest conversation they'd had in 10 months. It was the easiest. Marco drove back to the penthouse afterward and sat in his office and called Dante Cruz, his underboss, and told him he needed the next 2 weeks managed without daily escalations to him unless the situation was critical. Dante's silence on the other end had a texture to it. "How critical," Dante said. "If it isn't bleeding, handle it." Another pause. "You good?" "Handle it, Dante." He ended the call. 4 days in, everything started moving faster than he was ready for. It was a Wednesday afternoon when David Ashworth appeared. Marco was in the NICU waiting room. Elena was inside with Noah and a nurse doing a developmental assessment, and Marco had stepped out to take a call from his attorney about the Cascadia Partners matter, which had escalated in ways that required his attention regardless of how much he wanted to ignore it. He was standing by the window, phone to his ear, when the elevator opened and a man walked out who matched the photograph in Nico's report with the precision of something Marco had been unconsciously preparing himself for. Ashworth was tall, broad-shouldered in the way of a man who rode or swam rather than lifted weights. He was wearing a sport coat over a collared shirt, no tie, carrying a small paper bag with a bakery logo on it. The particular casual confidence of a man who knew he was welcome somewhere and didn't feel the need to signal it. He had a good face, the kind of face that read as trustworthy before he opened his mouth because the proportions were right and the expression was open and nothing about him had ever needed to be careful. Marco ended his call. Ashworth was halfway down the corridor before he noticed Marco standing by the window, and in the half-second before his expression settled, Marco saw the recognition, not of Marco specifically, but of the category. A man who didn't belong in this corridor. A man whose stillness wasn't the stillness of someone waiting, but of someone occupying space deliberately. Ashworth slowed, stopped 3 feet away. "You're Marco Valenti," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Marco said. Ashworth absorbed this with the kind of composure that genuinely irritated Marco. Not performed calm, but actual calm. The calm of a man who had spent years delivering difficult news to scared parents and had learned to regulate his own anxiety out of professional necessity. "David Ashworth," he said, and offered his hand. Marco looked at the hand for a moment, then shook it. "I know," Marco said. Something moved across Ashworth's face. Not fear, not aggression, just the careful recalibration of a man assessing a situation with more variables than he'd anticipated. He glanced at the NICU doors. Back at Marco. "She told me you came," Ashworth said. "She tell you anything else?" "That you're Noah's father," a pause, "and that she hadn't decided anything yet." Marco said nothing. "I want you to know," Ashworth said, and his voice was steady, professional, the voice of a man used to saying hard things clearly, "that I'm not here to compete with you. That's not what I'm doing. I'm here because Elena asked me to bring her lunch, and because I care about her and about Noah." He held up the bakery bag slightly. "That's it." Marco looked at him. "Okay," Marco said. Ashworth clearly hadn't expected that response. He'd been braced for something, a territorial display, a threat, something that matched the version of Marco Valenti that existed in whatever he'd read or heard. The flatness of okay threw him. "I'm not naive about who you are," Ashworth said after a moment. "No?" "No." He met Marco's eyes. "And I'm not going to pretend that doesn't matter, for Noah's sake." There it was, the thing he'd been building toward, reasonable, undeniable, delivered without malice. The implicit argument, the life you live is a danger to this child, and we both know it, and the decent thing is for you to acknowledge it. Marco felt the anger move through him like a current, not at Ashworth specifically, who was not wrong about anything he'd said, but at the situation, at the clean unfairness of a world where a man could spend 20 years building something and have it used as evidence against him in the only argument that had ever actually mattered. "I appreciate your honesty," Marco said. Ashworth blinked. "Marco," Elena's voice. She was standing in the doorway of the NICU, and her eyes moved from Marco to David and back to Marco with the rapid assessment of a woman who had just understood exactly what had been happening in this corridor while she was inside. She came out. She touched Ashworth's arm briefly, a gesture so natural it landed like a fist, and looked at Marco with something between apology and warning. "I didn't know you'd be here at the same time," she said. "It's fine," Marco said. It wasn't fine. All three of them knew it wasn't fine. But the word created a temporary structure that let them all remain standing. That night, Marco sat across from Dante Cruz in the back room of a restaurant in Belltown that served as one of their regular meeting locations. Good food, private corner, owner who understood the value of not remembering faces. Dante was 44, Cuban-American, built like a man who'd spent his youth doing things that required physical force and his adulthood learning to apply that force more selectively. He'd been with Marco for 11 years. He was also, as Marco was aware, the person in the organization most likely to tell him something he didn't want to hear, which was why he was in the position he was in. "The Portland thing isn't resolving itself," Dante said, cutting into his steak. "Reyes thinks the Kowalski crew is making moves on the distribution corridor. If we don't send someone up there with authority to negotiate or apply pressure, we're going to lose the contract by end of month." "Send Tomas." "Tomas doesn't have the weight for it. Kowalski won't take him seriously." Dante looked up. "It needs to be you or it needs to be me. And if it's me, you're running the Bellucci meeting alone next week, which—" "I'll handle Bellucci," Marco said. Dante put his fork down. "What's going on with you?" he said. It wasn't a question either. Dante had learned that from Marco. Marco said nothing. "The guys are noticing," Dante said, his voice lower now, not accusatory, but direct in the way that was the only reason Marco tolerated this conversation. "You've been in and out for 4 days, distracted. Reardon asked me yesterday if something was wrong at the top, and I told him no, but I need to know if that was a lie." "It wasn't a lie." "Then what is it?" Marco looked at his food. "Personal," he said. "Personal." Dante said the word like he was turning it over, examining it for structural integrity. "How personal?" "As personal as it gets." A long silence. The restaurant noise continued around them. Silverware, low conversation, the specific ambient texture of a room full of people eating and not paying attention to anyone else. "You need anything from me?" Dante asked. "Keep things running. I'll be back to full capacity in 2 weeks." And if something breaks before 2 weeks, then call me and I'll handle it. Dante picked up his fork again. All right. He ate. Then, she must be something else. Marco looked at him. The personal situation, Dante said, not looking up from his plate. Whatever it is, she must be something else. Marco didn't answer, but Dante was smarter than most people gave him credit for. And he let the silence stand, and they finished their dinner without speaking about it again. The following Saturday, Elena brought Noah home, not to Medina, to her apartment in Capitol Hill, a 2-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a pre-war building with tall windows and hardwood floors, and the kind of character that expensive new construction was always trying and failing to imitate. Marco arrived 20 minutes after she did, carrying a bag he'd had his assistant put together, things he'd researched at 2 in the morning on a parenting website that he would not under any circumstances admit to having visited. The specific brand of swaddle blanket 3 pediatric nurses had reviewed highest, a white noise machine with 12 sound settings, a thermometer that was reportedly easier to use correctly than the standard kind. Elena opened the door and looked at the bag. I did research, Marco said. Something moved across her face. She stepped back and let him in. The apartment was warm and slightly chaotic in the way of a space that had been prepared for a baby's arrival. A bassinet in the living room, a changing station assembled with its pieces still slightly askew, a pile of clean laundry on the couch that hadn't been put away yet. It looked lived in, real. Nothing about it resembled the spaces Marco occupied, which were always ordered, always controlled, always structured around the elimination of chaos. He found it unexpectedly the most comfortable room he'd been in months. Elena was settling Noah into the bassinet, moving with the efficient economy of a woman who had learned to do this with precision because the alternative was panic. And Marco stood in the entry of the living room and watched and understood that he was witnessing something he had no competence in yet. A world with rules he didn't know, a skill set he didn't have, a language of care and attention and physical attentiveness that was completely outside the vocabulary he'd spent his life developing. Come here, Elena said without looking up. He crossed the room. Sit, she said, nodding at the chair beside the bassinet. He sat. She lifted Noah out of the bassinet, the careful 2-handed lift of a practiced parent, and stood in front of him and said, Arms out, bent, support the head. He did what she said, and then Noah was in his arms, the weight of him. Marco had held things carefully before, fragile things, expensive things, things where the cost of dropping them was very high. This was different from all of that. The weight of his son in his arms was not about cost or risk or consequence. It was simply present, specific, the most real thing he had touched in years. Noah looked up at him with unfocused eyes. Marco looked back. Hi, he said, very quietly, to a person who could not yet understand the word. Elena sat on the couch across the room and watched and said nothing. For 20 minutes, nobody spoke. Then Marco's phone rang. He looked at the screen. Dante. He looked at Noah. He looked at the phone. He let it ring. It rang again 30 seconds later. Then a text. Bellucci moved the meeting up. Tonight, he says non-negotiable. Waiting on your word. Elena could see his face. She was watching him read the message, and when he looked up at her, the expression she had on was not surprised and not angry, and somehow that was worse than either of those things would have been. Go, she said. Elena, Marco. Her voice was quiet. I know what that face means. He looked at his son in his arms, then back at her. I'll be back tomorrow morning, he said. She nodded once. He transferred Noah back to her with the careful 2-handed delivery she'd shown him. He stood. He picked up his jacket from the chair. At the door he turned back. Elena was sitting with Noah against her shoulder, one hand on the baby's back, looking at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. Not disappointment exactly, not resignation exactly, something harder than both. The expression of a person watching a pattern repeat itself and noting it, clinically, for the record. I'll be back, he said again. I know you believe that, she said. He left. The Bellucci meeting lasted 4 hours. Vincent Bellucci was 63 years old and ran the only other organization in the Pacific Northwest with enough size and structure to be considered a genuine counterweight to Marco's operation. They had maintained an uneasy peace for 6 years. Territorial agreements, shared use of certain shipping infrastructure, a mutual understanding that direct conflict was expensive for both sides. Bellucci had requested this meeting, and the advance of the timeline meant something had changed in his calculation. It had. "I'm hearing things," Bellucci said, over coffee in the private room of a restaurant in Sodo that was 3 steps up from the Belltown place in terms of decor, and 3 steps down in terms of actual food quality. Things about your attention being elsewhere. Things about decisions getting made below you that wouldn't have been made if you were sharp. Marco looked at him. "Who's saying that?" "People." Bellucci spread his hands, a gesture that was both evasive and deliberate, a reminder that the specific names were less important than the fact of circulation. The point isn't the source. The point is the story that's moving. And what do you want me to do about it? I want you to tell me it isn't true. Bellucci's eyes were steady. Because if it is true, the agreement we have needs to be renegotiated. The terms were built on a specific balance of power, and if that balance has shifted, it hasn't shifted, Marco said. Then show me. Bellucci leaned forward slightly. The Kowalski situation in Portland. Handle it, publicly enough that it registers. Remind everyone that the machinery is still running at the top. Marco sat with that. The Kowalski situation required his presence. Dante had said so. Bellucci was now saying so, which meant the story had traveled farther than Marco had thought, which meant the window for managing it quietly had already closed. 2 weeks ago, the answer would have been immediate. Now he sat in a private dining room at 10:30 at night and thought about a woman sitting on a couch in Capitol Hill with a baby against her shoulder, and an expression he was going to spend a long time trying not to think about. "I'll go to Portland," Marco said. "End of the week." Bellucci nodded. They shook hands. Marco drove home through the wet city and went to bed at 1 in the morning and lay in the dark staring at the ceiling and thought about the phone he'd let ring and the look on Elena's face when he'd left and the particular sentence she'd said that kept cycling back through his head, no matter how many times he tried to move past it. "I know you believe that. Not, I believe you. Not, I'll be here. Just, I know you believe that." The most precise and devastating thing she could have said. The sentence that meant, "I see you clearly, and what I see is a man who means what he says in the moment he says it, and cannot yet promise that the moment will hold." He lay there a long time. His phone buzzed at 2 a.m. Not Dante this time. A number he recognized, Elena's. He answered immediately. Silence on the other end for a moment. Then, very quietly, the specific sound of an infant in distress. Not the outraged hunger sound she'd described. Something different. Something higher and more urgent. "His temperature is elevated," Elena said. Her voice was controlled. She was in attorney mode. Calm because calm was required. "I've called the on-call line. They think it might be a minor infection. They want me to bring him in." "I'll be there in 10 minutes, Marco said. He was already out of bed. "Marco, you don't have to—" 10 minutes, he said, and ended the call. He was in his car in 4 and at her building in 9, and she was waiting in the lobby with Noah strapped to her chest in a carrier, her coat half-buttoned, her face doing the thing it did when she was operating on pure function and refusing to let the fear in. They went together. Noah's temperature broke at the hospital by 4 in the morning. A minor infection, exactly as the on-call nurse had suspected. Easily treated, already responding to the antibiotic, the numbers moving in the right direction with the reliable obedience of a body that was, fundamentally, healthy. They sat in the small family waiting room. The same room where they'd stood 10 days ago, the same chairs, the same window. And at 4:30 in the morning, Elena put her head back against the wall and closed her eyes, and the control she'd been maintaining all night, finally, fractionally, let go. She didn't cry. She was too tired for that. But her face, with her eyes closed, showed everything she'd been carrying, and Marco sat next to her and looked at her profile in the flat waiting room light and felt the specific weight of what it meant to have been absent for this. For all of it. Every night she'd sat in a room like this one alone, every decision she'd made without anyone to make it with, every version of this fear she'd metabolized alone because there had been no one else. "I'm sorry," he said. She didn't open her eyes. "I know," she said. A silence. "I'm going to have to go to Portland," he said, "at the end of the week. 2 days, maybe 3. Her eyes opened. She looked at him. "Okay," she said. "Elena. Marco." She sat up, turned to face him. Her eyes were clear in a way that was worse than anger. The clarity of someone who has made a decision and is about to tell you what it is. "I need to say something, and I need you to actually hear it." He looked at her. "I am not going to do this again," she said. "I can't. I will not be in a situation where I'm waiting, where I'm managing alone because the other person's life operates on a schedule that doesn't include us. I did that for 10 months. I did it before that when we were together, every time your phone pulled you out of a room." Her voice was steady, and it cost her something to keep it that way. Noah is going to need a father who is actually present, not a man who shows up when it's convenient and disappears when it isn't. If you can't be that person, if the life you live makes it impossible to be that person, then I need to know that now. Marco didn't speak. "David," she began. "Don't," he said. "I have to," she said. David can give him that. A stable home. A man who comes home at night. A life without... She stopped. Chose her next word carefully. Without exposure. "I know what Ashworth can give him," Marco said, and the control in his own voice surprised him. Not the practiced control, the forced kind, but something quieter and more honest. "I've thought about it every day this week. I've looked at his life on paper and understood every single reason why it's the better answer on paper." "Then, but he's my son," Marco said. The words sat in the room, not as a claim, not as a threat, just as the fact it was bare and immovable and incapable of being negotiated away by any amount of reasonable argument. Elena looked at him for a long moment. "1 month," she said finally. He stayed still. "You have 1 month," she said. "Show me. Not words, not plans, not promises." "I've heard promises." Her eyes held his. "Show me you can be in his life in a way that's real, that's consistent, that doesn't disappear when your other world calls. And if I can't," she's held his gaze, "then I give David my answer," she said, "and you and I figure out what visitation looks like." It was the most honest thing anyone had ever offered him. A real chance with a real consequence, the kind of terms you gave someone when you respected them enough not to pretend the stakes weren't what they were. Marco looked at his son, asleep in Elena's arms, finally peaceful at 4:30 in the morning in a hospital waiting room. 1 month, he said. "Starting now," she said. He nodded. She looked at him a moment longer. The attorney's look, the one that meant she was filing this moment for future reference, and then looked back at Noah. And Marco sat there in the waiting room light and understood that the conversation they'd just had was not a beginning. It was a sentence with a deadline. And somewhere across the city, Vincent Bellucci was waiting on a show of force, and Dante Cruz was managing a situation that needed more than managing, and the machinery of the life Marco had built was continuing to turn without him. The clock had started, and for the first time in his life, Marco Valenti was not certain he could win. The month started on a Tuesday. Marco marked it the way he marked everything that mattered, not on a calendar, not in writing, but in the specific chamber of his mind where he kept the things he could not afford to forget. Tuesday, 4:47 a.m., a hospital waiting room, a woman with exhausted eyes making him the only offer that had ever actually cost him something to consider. He drove back to the penthouse as the city was waking up. Garbage trucks on the side streets, the first commuters moving through the gray pre-dawn, Seattle assembling itself for another day with the indifferent efficiency of a machine that didn't care who was watching. He showered, changed, made coffee, sat at his desk and looked at the stack of things requiring his attention and made a list, in his head, of what could be delegated and what couldn't. Portland couldn't be delegated. He called Dante at 6. "I'm going Thursday," Marco said. "Back Saturday. Get me a meeting with Kowalski for Friday morning." "Already set it up for Friday afternoon," Dante said. "Kowalski's people confirmed last night. Move it to morning." "Why?" "Because I want to be back by Saturday." A pause. Dante was smart enough to hear what wasn't being said. "Done," he said. Marco ended the call and opened his laptop and looked at the Bellucci notes from 2 nights ago and thought about exposure. The word Elena had used carefully, the word that meant everything she hadn't said directly. exposure. The risk of being adjacent to what he was. The cost, measured in things that couldn't be replaced. He thought about that for a long time. Then he called his attorney, a careful man named Hargrove, who had been managing the legal architecture of Marco's operation for 9 years, and told him he wanted a consultation. Not about Cascadia Partners, about something else. What kind of something else? Hargrove said. Structural, Marco said. What it would look like to begin separating from certain holdings, legitimizing the portfolio over a defined timeline. The silence on Hargrove's end was the longest pause Marco had ever gotten from a man who billed $400 an hour and didn't waste seconds. That's a significant conversation, Hargrove said carefully. I know what it is, Marco said. Set up a meeting this week before I leave for Portland. He hung up. He sat in the early morning quiet of his penthouse and looked at the city and understood that he had just said, out loud, the thing he'd been thinking without language for the last 4 days. The thing that lived below strategy and below calculation, and the part of him that had put his hand against an incubator's glass and felt the whole structure of his life become suddenly insufficient. He didn't know if it was possible. He didn't know if 20 years of what he'd built could be unwound in a way that left anything standing. But he had made a promise with a deadline, and he was going to find out. The next 9 days were the closest thing to a double life Marco had ever run. And he had, at various points in his career, literally run double lives, maintaining cover identities across 2 cities during a particularly complicated territorial negotiation. This was different. This was not strategy. This was just Tuesday morning in Elena's apartment learning to manage a feeding schedule, and Wednesday afternoon on a call with his distribution coordinator in Tacoma, working through a supply irregularity, and Thursday in Portland in a room with Dmitry Kowalski and 3 of Kowalski's men making the kind of argument that required its conclusion to be visible in the room before it was spoken. Kowalski got the message. Marco was back in Seattle by Saturday noon. He brought Noah a stuffed bear from the Portland airport gift shop, a purchase he made standing in the terminal with his jacket still carrying the specific tension of the Kowalski meeting, buying a stuffed animal for a 5-month-old who would not understand what it was, and feeling, strangely, like this was the most honest thing he'd done all week. Elena looked at the bear when he arrived, then at him. "How was Portland?" she said. "Handled," he said. She nodded and handed him Noah and went to make coffee. And Marco sat on the couch with his son and the stuffed bear and the afternoon light coming through the tall windows, and something in his chest that had been clenched for days released by a fraction of a degree. They were finding a rhythm. It surprised him, the rhythm, not because he hadn't hoped for it, but because he hadn't expected it to feel the way it did. He'd expected it to feel like effort, like discipline, like the application of will to an unfamiliar domain. And it was those things. But it was also something else. Something he didn't have a clean word for. The specific satisfaction of a task that required his full attention and returned something real when he gave it. Noah was a demanding presence. Not in the dramatic sense. He wasn't colicky, wasn't difficult in the ways Marco had anxiously researched online at 2 in the morning, but he required attention, constant, calibrated, responsive attention. The kind that couldn't be managed or delegated or handled through a chain of command. He needed to be picked up at the right moment and put down at the right moment and fed on a schedule that didn't negotiate and held in a specific way that required both hands and complete focus. Marco was good at complete focus. It turned out that was transferable. By the end of the second week, he could read Noah's pre-cry signals. The particular quality of restlessness that meant hunger versus the quality that meant overstimulation, with an accuracy that surprised Elena and surprised him more. He could execute the swaddle she'd shown him on day 1 with enough competence that Noah stayed settled. He learned the exact weight of pressure on the back during a burp that worked without being too much, the specific angle of holding that kept the gas from building, the white noise setting, Bachayang, setting 4, the one that sounded like rain, that reliably extended a nap by 20 minutes. He learned these things the way he'd learned everything that mattered in his life. By paying attention, by accepting failure without taking it personally, by doing the thing again until the thing was done right. Elena watched him learn. She didn't say much about it. She was not a woman who performed approval. She didn't offer praise as a management tool or withhold it as leverage. But he caught her watching him sometimes when she thought he wasn't tracking her, with an expression that was different from the careful legal assessment she'd been running since the night in the NICU. Something more unguarded. Something that looked like a person revising a conclusion they'd thought was final. David Ashworth called her on a Thursday evening while Marco was there. Marco was in the kitchen heating a bottle, a task that required the specific temperature check Elena had demonstrated, inner wrist, not fingertip. And he heard her voice shift in the living room, the particular register that meant she was being careful with her words. He didn't move any faster. He didn't strain to hear. He stood at the counter and held the bottle under warm water and waited for the right temperature and thought about nothing but the task in front of him. When he came back to the living room, she was off the phone. "David," she said, unnecessarily. "I figured," Marco said. He sat down and gave Noah the bottle and didn't ask anything else. And after a moment, Elena sat on the couch across from him, and they stayed there in the quiet of the evening with the baby eating and the city outside and everything still unresolved between them. But the quality of the unresolved thing had changed. It was no longer actively hostile. It was something that had learned to exist alongside the present moment without constantly demanding resolution. He wasn't sure what to do with that. He wasn't sure it was safe to trust it. 16 days in, Dante called at 7 in the morning with a voice that Marco had heard before. Flat, minimal. The voice of a man delivering information he wishes he didn't have. "We have a problem," Dante said. "Tell me." "The Hargrove meeting, the one about restructuring." Marco went still. "What about it?" "Someone talked." Pause. "I don't know who, but Bellucci knows you were asking about separating from holdings, legitimizing the portfolio." Another pause. Longer. "He's calling it a signal, that you're looking to cooperate with Federal." The word cooperate landed the way Dante knew it would. In their world, cooperate had one meaning. It was the word that preceded the end of things. The end of agreements, the end of protection, sometimes the end of people. It was the accusation that, once made, didn't require proof to do damage. Rumors of cooperation spread through a criminal organization the way fire spread through dry wood, faster than logic, indifferent to facts, consuming the structure before anyone could assess the actual source. "Who else has heard this?" Marco said. "As of this morning?" "Bellucci's people, the Kowalski crew," which explains why Kowalski was more compliant than expected in Portland. He was already pulling back, already calculating the realignment. Dante stopped. "And Reardon." Reardon. Thomas Reardon, who ran Marco's logistics network across 6 states, who had been in the organization for 8 years, who had sat across from Marco at dozens of tables, in dozens of rooms, and had never once, not once, given Marco a reason to question his position. "How did Reardon hear it?" Marco said. Silence. "Dante?" "I don't know how to say this without just saying it," Dante said. "Then say it." The leak came from inside Marco. It didn't start with Bellucci. Bellucci heard it from someone who already knew about the Hargrove meeting before it happened. Someone who was positioned to know. A breath. "I've been running it back, and the only people who knew about that call in advance were you, Hargrove, and the 2 people who coordinate your schedule." Marco sat in the silence of that for a moment. "Carver," he said. "That's where the trail goes," Dante said. Carver, the young man who drove him, who watched elevator feeds, who had the car running before Marco reached the lobby because he paid such close attention to habit, to pattern, to routine, that he could predict Marco's movements before Marco made them, who had, in the course of that close attention, learned exactly where Marco had been going for the last 16 days, who had heard the word Portland and Kowalski and Hargrove and restructuring, and who had made a calculation, a young man's calculation, a scared or greedy or pressured man's calculation, about where to bring that information. "Where is he now?" Marco said. "Nico has him. I'll be there in 40 minutes. He was there in 32. The location was a warehouse space in Soto that the organization used for exactly this kind of conversation. Nothing dramatic about it, just a large empty room with adequate soundproofing and the kind of lighting that made everyone look like they were telling the truth whether they were or not. Carver was sitting in a chair in the center of the room. He was 26 years old, and he looked right now about 17, the specific compression of someone whose body has understood what their mind is still trying to process. He wasn't restrained. He hadn't been touched. Nico was leaning against the far wall with his arms crossed and his face doing the thing it did when he was waiting for instruction. Marco walked into the room and stood in front of Carver and looked at him. Carver looked back. His hands were on his knees. His breathing was shallow and visible. "How long?" Marco said. "Marco, how long?" Carver closed his eyes, opened them. 4 months. 4 months. Before Noah, before Elena. Before any of this, Carver had already been providing information to someone for 4 months. "To who?" Marco said. "A man named Sato. He works for—" Carver stopped. "Finish it." "He works for Bellucci." The room was very quiet. Marco looked at Carver and thought about the last 16 days. Every drive to Elena's apartment, every trip to the hospital, every location and time and departure logged in the mind of the young man sitting in front of him. Every pattern. "Did you tell them about the woman?" Marco said. Carver's jaw tightened. "Did you tell them about the woman and the child?" "I didn't know what it was," Carver said, and his voice was doing something unsteady. "I didn't know it was personal. I thought it was a contact. I reported locations, times. I didn't know—" "But you reported them." A silence that was its own answer. Marco turned away from him, walked to the far side of the room and stood with his back to Carver and pressed his hand flat against the cold concrete wall and breathed. Bellucci knew about Elena. That was the fact underneath everything else. The fact that made the organizational damage look small by comparison. Bellucci knew Marco had a woman he visited consistently, an address he returned to, a pattern of behavior that indicated something more than a professional contact. In their world, that information wasn't background noise. It was leverage. It was a target. He turned back. "Nico," he said. "Yeah," Nico said from the wall. "Get Elena Marlowe into a secure location, tonight. Her and the child." He was already pulling out his phone. "Don't tell her why yet. Tell her it's precautionary." "She's not going to like that," Nico said. "She doesn't have to like it." He looked at Carver one more time. "Put him somewhere he can't communicate. I'll decide what happens next after I've talked to Bellucci." He walked out of the room. He was halfway down the corridor, phone already to his ear, when it rang in his hand before he could place the call. Elena's number, which was not what he expected. He answered, "Marco." Her voice was different. Not the controlled attorney voice, not the exhausted mother voice. Something else, a frequency he hadn't heard from her before, tight and compressed. The voice of a person speaking quietly because someone nearby cannot hear them. "There's a man outside my building. He's been there for an hour. Black sedan, same spot. He doesn't look like he's waiting for someone." Marco stopped walking. "Are your doors locked?" he said. "Yes. Noah's with me. We're inside." A breath. "Marco, what's happening?" He started moving again, faster. "I'm coming," he said. "Do not open the door for anyone. Not the building manager, not a neighbor, no one. I'll call you when I'm in the elevator." "Marco." 20 minutes, he said. "I promise you 20 minutes. He was running by the time he hit the exit. He made it in 18. The black sedan was still there when he arrived. He had Nico's man confirm it before he went inside. A slow drive-by that clocked the plate and the single occupant and the angle of the man's attention, which was fixed on the building entrance with the specific patience of a professional who was doing surveillance rather than anything more immediate. Surveillance meant they hadn't moved yet. Surveillance meant there was still time. Marco went through the side entrance of Elena's building, the code he'd memorized on day 3 of the month, the entrance the residents used, unremarkable, and took the stairs to the 3rd floor and knocked on her door in the specific pattern they'd established, 3 paws 2, the week before for reasons he'd told her were cautionary without explaining why he thought caution was necessary. She opened the door before the echo died. She had Noah in the carrier against her chest, and she had her go-bag on her shoulder. He hadn't told her to have a go-bag. She'd assembled one herself sometime in the last 2 weeks, and the sight of it told him something about how well she understood the world she'd placed herself adjacent to by being with him, even in the careful, limited way she'd allowed. She looked at his face and read it completely. "How bad?" she said. "We need to move," he said. "I'll explain in the car. Tell me now." "Elena?" "Tell me now, Marco." He looked at her, standing in the doorway of her apartment with their son strapped to her chest, and her bag on her shoulder and her eyes demanding the truth, with the absolute certainty of a woman who had already calculated that being lied to was more dangerous than whatever the truth was. He told her, not everything, not Carver, not the organizational details, but the essential shape of it, Bellucci, the information that had moved, the fact that her address was known by people who operated in a world where known addresses were used. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for 3 seconds. "The man outside," she said. "Surveillance," he said. "Nothing immediate, but I'm not willing to wait for that to change." Another second. She stepped back from the doorway. "Then let's go," she said. She didn't ask where. She didn't ask for a guarantee. She walked out of her apartment with Noah and her bag, and pulled the door shut behind her and looked at him with an expression that contained no illusions. She knew exactly what she was walking into, what it meant to move under his protection, what it cost her to accept that protection. She walked into it anyway, because the alternative was the man in the sedan outside, and whatever came after the man in the sedan. They went down the stairs together in silence and out the side entrance and into the waiting car. Not Carver, someone else now, someone Nico had sent, and the city slid past the windows as they moved north, and Noah slept against Elena's chest with the total unconscious trust of a person who did not yet understand what it meant to be afraid. Marco sat beside her and looked at the dark street ahead and understood what had just happened. He had spent 16 days trying to prove he could live in both worlds simultaneously, the one he'd built and the one he wanted. He had been methodical about it, precise, the way he was precise about everything that mattered. And Bellucci had just demonstrated, with one sedan and one surveillance operation, that no amount of precision was going to make that possible. The two worlds could not coexist. One of them had to end. And sitting in the back of a car at midnight with his son sleeping 3 inches from his arm, Marco Valenti finally understood, not as a strategic conclusion, but as a physical certainty, the kind that lives in the body and not the mind, which one it was going to. The safe house was a townhouse in Eastlake that Marco had held under a shell company for 4 years without ever needing to use it. A contingency property, the kind of asset you maintained the way you maintained anything you hoped never to require. 3 bedrooms, reinforced doors, sight lines to the street from every front-facing window, a back exit through the alley that connected to a parallel street 2 blocks over. Nico had 2 men on the exterior before Marco's car arrived. Elena walked through the front door and looked at the space with the particular assessment of a woman cataloging exits, and she didn't say anything about the 2 men outside, or the reinforced door, or the fact that the windows had been fitted with privacy film that let light in and nothing out. She walked to the second bedroom, laid Noah down in the center of the bed surrounded by pillows, and stood over him for a moment with her hand on his back until his breathing settled. Then she came back to the living room. Marco was on the phone. He held up one finger. She sat down on the couch and waited, which was not something Elena Marlowe did naturally, and the effort of it was visible in the set of her jaw. He ended the call. "Hargrove is burning the documentation from our meeting," he said. "There's nothing on paper that confirms what the conversation was about." "Is that enough?" For the federal question, probably. For Bellucci? He stopped. Bellucci doesn't need documentation. He needs a reason, and someone handed him one. Carver. Yes, she absorbed that. What happens to Carver? He looked at her. "Don't," she said. "Don't give me the version you think I can handle. What happens to him?" Marco sat down across from her and laced his hands together and looked at the floor for a moment before looking back up. "He stays contained until this is resolved. After that," a pause. "I haven't decided." Marco. "I'm not going to lie to you about what my world does with informants," he said quietly. "You asked for the real answer. That's the real answer. I haven't decided." She held his eyes for a long moment. "He's 26 years old," she said. "I know how old he is. And if you—" "Elena." His voice wasn't hard, but it was final. "Let me get through tonight. Then we'll talk about Carver." She looked away, pressed her lips together. The lawyer in her was doing the thing it did, categorizing moral weight, calculating consequence. And he watched her do it and didn't interrupt. "Okay," she said finally. Not agreement, just the recognition that she didn't have a better option right now, which was its own kind of answer. He got up and went to the window and looked out at the street. Empty, wet, the streetlight making orange circles on the pavement. Nico's man was somewhere in the shadows near the corner, invisible if you didn't know to look. Marco knew to look. His phone buzzed. Dante. Bellucci wants a meeting, Dante said. Tonight. He's offering neutral ground. The Pier 56 warehouse. His people, our people, no weapons beyond personal carry. He's setting the terms. Yeah, which means he thinks he's already won something. What time? Midnight. Marco looked at the clock on the wall. 2 hours and 17 minutes. I'll be there, he said. Marco. Dante's voice shifted, lower, the frequency of a man saying something he means specifically. He's not coming alone to talk. You know that. I know that. Then you need more than Nico. Get me 4 men, good ones. Have them at Pier 56 by 11:30. He ended the call and turned back to the room. Elena was standing now, arms crossed, and she had heard enough of the conversation to understand the shape of what was coming. You're going to meet him, she said. Yes. Tonight. Yes. She unfolded her arms, refolded them. The gesture of a person whose body wanted to do something and couldn't figure out what. And you think that's... what? The solution? You walk into a room with the man who just put a surveillance team on my building and you talk it out? I walk into a room with the man and I make him understand that using you or Noah as leverage is the worst decision he's ever considered. His voice was level. And if he's already made that decision, I make him reverse it. How? He looked at her directly. By being the thing he's been trying to convince himself I'm no longer. She stared at him. Elena. He crossed the room and stopped 2 feet from her. Stay here. Keep the door locked. Nico's men are outside. I will be back before Noah wakes up for his 4 a.m. feeding. He held her eyes. I have never once in my life made you a promise I didn't intend to keep. You've made me promises you couldn't keep, she said. That's different from intending. Yes, he said, it is different. And I'm telling you, the difference matters tonight. She looked at him for a long moment, the full weight of her attention, the gaze that had never let him hide anything it was actually looking for. Come back, she said. 2 words. Not a demand, not a plea, just the most honest thing she knew how to say. Yes, he said. He got his jacket. He checked the piece at his hip. A reflex, muscle memory, the body remembering what the situation required before the mind caught up. He went to the second bedroom and stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at Noah asleep in the center of the bed with his arms raised, the rising and falling of his chest in the dim light, the total unguarded trust of his sleep. He stood there exactly 10 seconds. Then he left. Pier 56 was a working warehouse on the central waterfront, the kind of space that had been used for legitimate cargo for decades and continued to be used for legitimate cargo during the day and for other things at night, an arrangement maintained by the simple mechanism of everyone involved having a financial interest in not examining it too closely. The Puget Sound was black and cold beyond the loading dock doors. The wind off the water had teeth. Marco arrived at 11:40 with Nico and 4 men. Not showy, not a demonstration of force, just sufficient. The warehouse interior was lit by work lights that threw hard shadows across the concrete floor and the stacked cargo containers along the east wall. The smell was diesel fuel and brine, and the particular cold storage smell of a space that handled refrigerated goods. Bellucci was already there. He had 6 men arranged in a loose formation behind him, which told Marco that Bellucci had either overestimated how intimidated Marco would be or had underestimated how clearly Marco could read a room. The 6 men were spread too wide. They were trying to look like a conversation and position themselves for something that wasn't. Bellucci himself was standing in the center of the floor with his hands in his coat pockets, looking relaxed in the way that men looked relaxed when they were performing it for an audience. He was 63 years old, and he had survived 63 years in this world by being genuinely shrewd when it counted, and ruthless when shrewdness wasn't enough. Tonight, he looked like a man who thought he had the winning hand. Marco walked to within 10 feet of him and stopped. Neither man offered a hand. Marco, Bellucci said. Vincent. A silence that both of them let run longer than was comfortable because comfort was not the point. I heard something that concerned me, Bellucci said, about your intentions regarding the organization. You heard something that was incomplete and mischaracterized, Marco said. And then you sent a car to sit outside a woman's apartment. Bellucci tilted his head slightly. Precautionary. That's an interesting word for it. The way I heard it, you're looking to exit. Bellucci's voice was conversational, almost gentle. The voice of a man who had made this kind of calculation so many times it no longer required elevation. A man who's looking to exit has a different set of interests than a man who's committed. Different interests mean different loyalties. Different loyalties, he spread his hands. These are things that affect everyone in the arrangement. I was exploring options, Marco said. Legal restructuring, legitimate portfolio management. That's not cooperation with Federal, it's business. It's the first step toward cooperation with Federal. Every lawyer who's ever flipped a client has sold it to them as business first. Bellucci's eyes were steady. I've seen it too many times. I'm not your other clients. No, you're a man who spent 16 days learning to change diapers. Bellucci said it without venom, which was somehow worse than if he'd said it with venom. Just a fact, delivered flat, the way you delivered a card face up to make clear you were holding it. A man who's doing that is a man whose priorities have realigned. And a man whose priorities have realigned. Finish it, Marco said. Bellucci finished it with his eyes. The conclusion was clear enough that speaking it was unnecessary. Marco stood in the warehouse light and felt the cold coming off the water and understood exactly what he was being told. You are now a liability. And liabilities in this world have a known resolution. The woman has nothing to do with any of this, Marco said. His voice was quiet, the quietest it had been all night. The men behind Bellucci registered that register. The specific drop in volume that in their world meant the temperature had just changed. The child has nothing to do with any of this. You move against either of them, and there is no version of what happens next that ends well for you. Bellucci looked at him. Is that a threat? Bellucci said. It's a description, Marco said. A long moment. The water moved outside. The work lights hummed. Step away from the organization, Bellucci said. Clean, formal, acknowledged. Transfer the West Coast holdings to a structure I approve. You walk away, your woman walks away, your child... A pause. Everyone continues existing without difficulty. Marco looked at him. And if I don't? Then I have concerns that need to be managed. Bellucci's voice hadn't changed. And I manage my concerns the way I've always managed them. The warehouse was very quiet for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. Then Marco said, I'll give you an answer in 48 hours. Bellucci studied him, looking for the angle, the tell, the place where the response had a different meaning than its surface. He was smart enough to find what was there, and smart enough to know he couldn't be certain he was seeing all of it. 48 hours, Bellucci said. Yes. A nod. Bellucci turned and walked back toward his men, unhurried, the walk of a man who had said what he came to say and considered the meeting complete. One of his men, younger, positioned to Bellucci's left, with the particular tension in the shoulders of someone operating on instruction, moved a half-step wrong. Marco saw it before it happened. The way he saw things, not as a sequential observation, but as an all-at-once understanding, the animal part of the brain that existed before language and operated faster than thought, the part that had kept him alive in rooms exactly like this one for 2 decades. He moved left. The shot. Suppressed, not silent. The movies lied about that. There was still a sharp crack that echoed off the concrete, passed through the space where his head had been and hit the cargo container behind him with a sound like a hammer on steel. Then everything happened at once. Nico's men moved, not chaotic, trained, the controlled violence of people who had run this exact scenario enough times that their bodies operated ahead of their conscious minds. Marco was already low, already moving toward cover, the container wall 6 feet to his left, and he covered it in 2 strides and put his back to the steel and drew his piece, and the warehouse was suddenly full of the sounds that warehouses near water at midnight were not supposed to contain. It lasted 40 seconds. In the operational sense, 40 seconds is a long time. Long enough for positions to shift, for lines of sight to reconfigure, for the tactical landscape to change 3 times. Marco stayed behind the container and tracked sound and movement and gave no instruction. His men knew what to do, and instructions in the middle of this kind of thing created noise that got people killed. When the shooting stopped, 4 of Bellucci's men were down. One of Marco's men, a quiet, capable man named Prez, who had worked logistics for 3 years, was on the ground holding his left arm with his right hand. Not badly hurt, but hurt. Bellucci was standing against the far wall. He had not moved during the shooting. He stood with his back to the wall and his hands slightly out, and his face carrying the expression of a man who had just watched a plan fail and was now doing rapid triage on the situation. 2 of his men were still standing. They were looking at Marco and looking at Nico, and they were making the calculation that you made when the math had changed. "Tell them to put it down," Marco said. Bellucci looked at him across the warehouse. "Vincent," Marco said. "Tell them." A second. 2. "Down," Bellucci said. The 2 men lowered their weapons. Marco walked across the concrete floor to where Bellucci stood. He stopped 3 feet away and looked at him. Not with anger, not with triumph, just with the flat attention of a man who had just had someone try to kill him and had not died, and was now deciding what to do with the fact of that. "The 48 hours offer is gone," Marco said. Bellucci said nothing. "Here's what happens instead." Marco's voice was very steady. The steadiness of exhaustion past the point of performance. "You pull every asset away from that address in Capitol Hill. You pull everything away from anything connected to Elena Marlowe and that child. Tonight, before I leave this building." He held Bellucci's eyes. "And then we renegotiate. New terms, my timeline. No more surveillance, no more leverage plays, no more conversations about my private life. And if I say no," Bellucci said. "You just watched 4 of your 6 men go down in 40 seconds, Marco said. "Think about what your organization looks like at the end of a week in which you've declared open war on mine." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "You're a smart man, Vincent. You've survived this long because you know when a position is untenable." Bellucci looked at him. The look lasted long enough for Marco to see the thing that happened behind the older man's eyes. Not capitulation exactly, nothing that simple, but the specific readjustment of a man who had made an error in his threat assessment and was now correcting his model. "I'll make the call," Bellucci said. "Now," Marco said. "In front of me." Bellucci reached for his phone. Marco stood in the warehouse, in the cold, with the sound of the water outside and the smell of propellant in the air, and Press bleeding quietly against the container wall behind him, and watched Vincent Bellucci make the call that pulled his people back, and thought about Elena in the safe house waiting for him, and thought about Noah asleep with his arms raised. He thought about what came next, because this was not the end of it. He knew that. Bellucci pulling back tonight was not peace, it was pause. A tactical retreat from a man recalculating his options. The underlying problem had not been resolved, only delayed, and what happened in the next 48 hours would determine whether the delay became something more permanent or simply created space for a second attempt. The only way to resolve it permanently was the thing he'd already decided in the back of a car at midnight. He just hadn't known until tonight exactly what resolving it was going to cost. Bellucci ended the call. "Done," he said. Marco nodded. He turned and walked to where Prez was sitting against the container and crouched down and looked at the arm. "Through and through," Prez said. His jaw was tight, but his voice was level. "I've had worse." "I know you have," Marco said. He looked up at Nico. "Get him to the doctor, the one on Queen Anne." "Already texting him," Nico said. Marco stood. He looked around the warehouse. The damage, the men down, the work light still humming indifferently over all of it, and pulled out his phone and called Elena. She answered on the first ring. "Marco." Not a question. Just his name, carrying everything. "I'm leaving now," he said. "I'm coming back." A breath on her end. "Okay. Are you—" "We're fine," she said. "Noah's still asleep. I've been—" A pause. "I've just been here. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He drove back through the city. Different driver, Nico staying behind to manage the cleanup. And the rain had stopped and the streets were slick and reflective, and Seattle at 2 in the morning looked like a city that had decided to tell the truth about itself, stripped of its daytime performance, just the wet lights and the empty corners and the water somewhere below everything. He thought about what he had to do, not the Bellucci negotiation. That was mechanics. That was his world operating on its own logic, problems that had procedural solutions even when the procedures were ugly. He was thinking about Hargrove, about the conversation he'd started and then had to pause, about what it actually looked like, concretely, legally, financially, to dismantle a 20-year structure in a way that left something standing on the other side. The legitimate holdings were real. The Cascadia properties, 3 other investment vehicles, a logistics company in Tacoma that had been operating legitimately for the last 4 years. The legal money that had accumulated was not nothing. It wasn't enough to build a life on without the rest of it. But it was a place to start. The thing was, and he understood this with a clarity that the warehouse had burned clean, the way certain kinds of pressure burned things clean. The thing was that there was no version of tonight that could happen again. The man in the sedan outside Elena's building, the shot in the warehouse, the simple exposed reality of what his world looked like when it reached outside itself and touched something he could not afford to lose. There was no version of that happening again that he was willing to accept, which meant there was only one direction. He pulled up to the safe house and texted Nico's man. "Here." The door opened before he knocked. Elena was standing in the entry, still dressed, with the look of a person who had spent 2 hours in a room alone with her thoughts and had arrived somewhere on the other side of them. She looked at him, his jacket, his face, the specific quality of a man who has been in a situation and come out of it carrying the weight of what the situation was. She reached out and put her hand on his jaw. The gesture was so unexpected, so unguarded, so unlike the careful management of proximity they'd been maintaining, that he went completely still. She turned his face slightly toward the light and looked at him. "Are you hurt?" she said. "No." She looked at him another moment to confirm it. Then she dropped her hand and stepped back. "Come in," she said. He came in. He sat on the couch and she sat beside him. Not close, not touching, but beside him, which was its own statement. The house was quiet. Noah's breathing was audible from the second bedroom, the slow, deep rhythm of a child entirely at peace with the world. "I need to tell you something," Marco said. She looked at him. "I've been talking to my attorney about restructuring," he said. "Separating from the organization, legitimizing what can be legitimized." He looked at his hands. That's what Carver heard. That's what he passed to Bellucci. He looked up. "I was going to tell you when I had something concrete to show you. Not just words." Elena was quiet for a moment. "How long have you been thinking about it?" she said. "Since the first night in the hospital," he said. "Since I saw Noah." She absorbed that. "It's not simple," he said. "It's not. I'm not going to tell you it happens next month. There are structures that take time to unwind. There are obligations that require—" He stopped. "It takes time, but it's the direction I'm going, the only direction." She looked at him for a long time. "Bellucci," she said, "is handled, for now. For now. I'll make it permanent," he said. "I know what I have to do." She nodded slowly. Not "I believe you," not "I forgive you," just the nod of a woman processing information and not yet ready to convert it into a position. "I need you to understand something," she said. "Tell me. I can't keep doing this from a defensive position," she said. "Tonight, waiting here, not knowing, listening for— I can't do that. I won't do that to Noah." Her voice was steady, and it was costing her something. "If you're telling me you're moving towards something different, I need it to be real, not a plan, not a direction. Real, with actual steps and actual timelines and actual—" She stopped. "I need to see it moving." "I know," he said. "Because if it's not moving," she said, "then tonight is what our life looks like, and I will not raise him in that." The house held the silence around them. Marco looked at her. In the dim light of the safe house, exhausted and honest and still sitting beside him instead of across the room from him, which meant something, which meant everything, and understood that this was the last version of the choice he was going to get, not the abstract choice, not the theoretical weight of one life versus another, empire versus family, power versus presence. The actual choice. Right now. In a room that smelled like recycled air and his son's sleeping breath. I know, he said again. And then, I'm done, Elena. Not moving toward done. Done. She looked at him. I need you to mean that, she said. I mean it, he said. Another silence. Then she leaned her head back against the couch and closed her eyes and let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep. The breath of a person releasing something they'd been holding for a long time. Not all the way, not with full trust, but enough to make the next moment livable. They sat there in the quiet. The city outside was still. Marco looked at the ceiling and thought about the call he was going to make in the morning, not to Hargrove, not to Dante, but to someone else. Someone he'd been aware of for 2 years, had always filed away as a worst-case option, had never expected to actually use. A federal contact. Not cooperation in the way Bellucci had imagined. Not testimony, not a flip, not the kind of arrangement that ended careers and sometimes ended more than careers. Something more structural. Something that could be built into the legal unwinding, that could provide a framework, that could make the separation clean and documented and protected in ways that private legal counsel alone couldn't provide. It was the most dangerous phone call he could make. It was also the only one that solved the problem completely, permanently, in a way that Bellucci or anyone else could not unsolve with a car and a warehouse and 6 men who turned out to be insufficient. He looked at the door to the second bedroom. He thought about Noah with his arms raised, trusting the world to hold him up. Marco Valenti sat in the dark and made his... The call took 11 minutes. Marco made it from the kitchen of the safe house at 3:40 in the morning, standing at the window with a glass of water he didn't drink, watching the alley behind the building while the phone rang twice and then connected to a voicemail he'd memorized 2 years ago without ever expecting to use. He left a message. 12 words, no more. His name, a callback number that routed through a clean line, and the phrase that the man on the other end would understand without elaboration. I want to talk about a structural exit. Call me. He set the phone down on the counter and stood in the kitchen and listened to the safe house breathe around him. Elena asleep finally in the second bedroom, Noah beside her, the two of them occupying a room he'd stood in the doorway of for 3 minutes before making the call, watching them in the dim light and letting that image be the last thing he held in his mind before he did what he was about to do. He'd needed it there, as ballast. He went to the couch and lay down without taking his jacket off and closed his eyes and did not sleep, but rested in the way you rested when sleep was unavailable, conscious, quiet, letting the body recover what the mind couldn't stop working on. At 6:15, the phone rang. The man's name was Carrillo. He was a senior investigator with the Justice Department's Organized Crime Division, based in Seattle, and Marco had known of his existence for 2 years through the lateral awareness that came from operating in a world where federal attention was a constant environmental fact, like weather. Carrillo had been building a case on Bellucci for 4 years. Marco knew this the way he knew most things about the landscape he moved through. Indirectly, incrementally, through the accumulation of small pieces of information that his people gathered without being specifically tasked to gather them. He'd known Carrillo existed. He'd never expected to be the one to call him. Mr. Valenti, Carrillo said. His voice was careful in the way of a man who had learned not to react to surprises before he understood them. I'm going to say this once, and then we're going to arrange a proper conversation, Marco said. I'm not a witness. I'm not a cooperator in the traditional sense. What I am is a man who wants a documented, legally structured exit from a set of holdings and operations, with federal oversight of the process, in exchange for specific information about specific operations that are ongoing and that fall outside the scope of my own activities. A silence. Bellucci, Carrillo said. Among others. Another silence, longer. Marco could hear the specific quality of a man recalibrating rapidly. The suppressed urgency of someone who had just received information they'd been working toward for years and was trying not to let the wanting of it make him sloppy. I'll need this to go through proper channels, Carrillo said. Documentation. Counsel present. I have counsel, Marco said. His name is Hargrove. Have your people contact his office today. I want a meeting by end of week. That's fast. I'm aware, Marco said. That's the timeline. He ended the call. He lay on the couch in the gray morning light coming through the privacy-filmed windows and thought about what he'd just done, turning it over in his mind the way you turn something over to make sure you'd seen all its sides. He'd made calls like this before, calls that changed the shape of things, that set processes in motion that couldn't be recalled once started. This one had a different weight. All the others had been about power, acquiring it, maintaining it, redirecting it. This one was about something that didn't have a clean strategic name, something that lived below strategy. He thought about Dante, about what this was going to do to the people in the organization who had built their lives alongside his. The ones who had been loyal because they believed in what he was, who had structured their own existence around the stability of his. The unwinding was not going to be clean. Some of them would find their footing. Some wouldn't. That was a cost he was going to have to carry, and he knew it, and he didn't allow himself to minimize it by looking away from it. He carried it. Then he got up, folded the blanket he hadn't used, set it on the arm of the couch, and went to make coffee. Elena woke at 7. She came out of the bedroom with Noah in the carrier and her hair down and the specific compressed alertness of a person who had slept badly but refused to let it show more than physiologically necessary. She looked at Marco at the kitchen counter and at the coffee already made and at the expression on his face. "You didn't sleep," she said. "I made a call," he said. She looked at him. He told her. Not everything. Not the operational details. Not the specifics of what information he was prepared to provide Carrillo and what he wasn't. But the shape of it. The federal contact. The structured exit. The documentation that would make it permanent and protected and real in a way that a private conversation with his attorney never could have been. Elena listened without moving. She was standing in the middle of the kitchen with Noah against her chest and her hand on his back, and she listened to all of it with the same focused stillness she brought to courtroom testimony. Not passive, but actively receiving, filing, processing. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You understand what this means for your people," she said. Not an accusation, a question. "Yes," he said. "Some of them will face—" "I know what some of them will face," he said. "The information I'm providing is specific. It's about operations I was not a principal in. I'm not burning everyone to get out the door." He looked at her. "But I know it's not nothing. I know it costs people." She looked at him carefully. "And you're doing it anyway," she said. "Yes." She nodded, slowly. The nod of a woman who had spent her career understanding that moral choices in complicated situations were rarely clean, that the best available option was frequently also a damaging one, that the measure of a person wasn't the absence of cost, but the willingness to carry it honestly. She poured herself coffee. "Hargrove is good," she said, "but you need someone who specifically handles federal agreements. I know someone at a firm in Belltown. She's done this kind of structural negotiation before." Marco looked at her. "You'd do that," he said. "Give you a referral?" She looked at him over the cup. "Yes, Marco. I'd give you a referral." Something in the way she said it, matter of fact, without theater, as if of course she would help, as if the question of whether they were on the same side had been answered somewhere in the last 12 hours, and she was simply operating from that answer now, landed on him in a way he wasn't prepared for. He looked at his coffee. "Thank you," he said. She said nothing, but she stayed in the kitchen. The week that followed was the most procedurally dense of Marco's life, which was saying something for a man who had structured 20 years of complex operations across multiple jurisdictions. Hargrove and the woman Elena referred, a precise, unflappable attorney named Desai, who had the specific quality of a person who had seen everything and was no longer capable of being rattled by new additions to that list, worked in parallel, one managing the federal negotiation and one managing the civil restructuring of the legitimate holdings. The two processes were intertwined in ways that required constant coordination, and Marco sat in more conference rooms in 5 days than he'd sat in the previous year, going through documents with the methodical attention of a man who understood that every line he signed was a line between one version of his life and another. Carrillo was thorough. Marco had expected that. He was also, in his way, fair. He was interested in Bellucci's ongoing operations, in the Kowalski corridor arrangement, and 3 other specific targets that fell within his existing case framework. He was not interested in expanding the scope beyond what was useful, which meant that the people in Marco's organization who had operated within the legitimate structures, the logistics company, 2 of the Cascadia properties, the staff who hadn't known what they were adjacent to, had a path through. Not everyone did. Dante came to see him on a Wednesday evening, not at the penthouse. Marco had moved out of the penthouse, was staying at the Eastlake safe house while the transition paperwork moved through its various stages, but at a coffee place in Capitol Hill that Dante had chosen, which was its own message. Neutral ground, a public place. The conversation of 2 men who were not sure yet what category they occupied for each other. Dante sat across from him and ordered black coffee and looked at him without preamble. "It's done," Dante said. "I know it's done. I'm not here to argue about it." "Okay," Marco said. "I want to know if the Tacoma operation is protected." Dante's voice was level. Business. The voice of a man who had adapted to situations faster than most people could identify them. The logistics company. The employees there don't know anything about the other side of it. They're just people doing a job. "They're protected," Marco said. "Desai has the documentation. The company stands as a legitimate entity. No federal interest." Dante nodded. He turned his coffee cup on the table. "And the other operations?" "Carrillo has what he needs," Marco said. "I kept it specific. I kept it to Bellucci and the Kowalski arrangement. That's where the federal interest is anyway." Dante nodded again. He was quiet for a moment. "You know Bellucci's going to know it came from you," Dante said. "Bellucci's going to be too busy managing a federal investigation to do anything about that," Marco said. "Carrillo moves fast when he has something solid. He'll have warrants before Bellucci knows the meeting happened. And after, Bellucci is either in custody or in the process of becoming custody. The organization fractures. The people who replace him have their own problems to manage." Marco looked at him. The calculus changes. Dante absorbed this. He was doing the math that men like him did. The survival math. The positioning math. The assessment of where the ground was going to be stable when the dust settled. "I've been offered a position," Dante said. "The Tacoma operation. Operational manager. Legitimate." He said the word the way people said it when they were still getting used to how it felt in their mouth. "Desai's people reached out yesterday." "I know," Marco said. "I asked her to." Dante looked at him. "You could have told me," Dante said. "I'm telling you now," Marco said, "because I wanted to see you first. Not through a lawyer." A silence. The coffee place moved around them. The ordinary midweek afternoon of a neighborhood that didn't know or care what was being decided at the corner table. "It's a good operation," Marco said. "The revenue is real, the contracts are clean, and you'd be good at it." "I know I'd be good at it," Dante said. Not defensively, just confirming a fact. "Then take it," Marco said. Dante looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across his face that was not quite emotion in the soft sense, more like the acknowledgement of a chapter, the recognition of what was being closed. "What are you going to do?" Dante said. Marco thought about the house in Fremont. He'd found it 3 days ago, not through a search, or not primarily through a search. He'd been driving through the neighborhood with no particular destination, which was not something Marco Valenti did, but the last 2 weeks had produced a version of him that did things without particular destinations. And he'd turned onto a residential street and seen a for sale sign in front of a craftsman house with a covered porch and a backyard that backed up to a greenbelt. And he'd pulled over and sat in the car looking at it for 10 minutes. Then he'd called the number on the sign. The house was 4 blocks from an elementary school. It had a second bedroom that could become a third with a simple renovation. The backyard was large enough for a swing set, and the greenbelt behind it meant the yard had no back neighbors. Just trees and the sound of birds in the morning. He'd put in an offer that afternoon. "I'm going to learn to live somewhere quieter," Marco told Dante. Dante looked at him. Then he did something Marco had seen him do exactly twice in 11 years. He smiled. Small, brief. The smile of a man who found something genuinely surprising in a world that had mostly stopped surprising him. "Good," Dante said. They finished their coffee. When they stood to leave, Dante held out his hand and Marco shook it, and that was all. No speech, no ceremony, just 2 men who had operated in close proximity for 11 years acknowledging the end of that proximity in the only language their world had ever been fluent in. Dante left first. Marco sat back down and finished his coffee alone, and looked out the window at the Capitol Hill afternoon and thought about how strange it was, the machinery of ending things, how it moved through its stages with the same procedural logic as everything else, producing paperwork and meetings and handshakes, the ordinary mechanics of an extraordinary dismantling. He left a tip that was too large. Then he went to see Elena. The offer on the Fremont house was accepted on a Friday. He told Elena that evening, not as a presentation, not with documentation or plans or any of the apparatus of persuasion. He just told her, sitting in the kitchen of the safe house, with Noah between them and the bouncer that had become a permanent fixture of the kitchen table arrangement, the baby doing the thing he'd started doing in the last week where he tracked faces with his eyes, following the movement of the people talking above him with an attention that was new and startling and somehow already entirely characteristic. "Fremont," Elena said. 4 blocks from McKinley Elementary, Marco said. "Large backyard, greenbelt behind it." She looked at him. "You went and bought a house," she said. "I put in an offer," he said. "It was accepted this morning, without talking to me." "Yes," he said, "because I didn't want to talk about it. I wanted to show you something was moving." He looked at her. "You told me not words, not plans." She was quiet for a moment. "That's in my neighborhood," she said. "I know. I mean, Fremont is 4 minutes from my apartment." "I know that too," he said. I'm not assuming anything about what the arrangement looks like, whether you stay in your apartment or whether eventually—" He stopped. "However it works, Noah should be able to get to both of us without it being a project." Elena looked at Noah. Noah looked at the light fixture above the table with the total absorption of someone who had just discovered that the world contained light fixtures. "Can I see it?" she said. "The house?" "Yes." "The keys are in my jacket," he said. "Jet." They drove to Fremont on a Saturday morning with Noah in the car seat and the October light coming in low and gold through the Seattle overcast, the specific quality of Pacific Northwest autumn that was neither warm nor cold, but something more particular, clear, clean, honest. The house looked better in daylight than it had the evening he'd first seen it. The covered porch faced east and caught the morning light. The yard was overgrown in the way of a place that had been empty for a season and was waiting for someone to decide what it wanted to become. The backyard backed up exactly as the listing had described, a green belt, mature firs, the sound of a creek somewhere behind the tree line. Elena walked through the rooms without speaking. Marco followed her and did not explain or narrate or fill the silence. He let her look. He let her assess. He watched her hand trail along the windowsill in the second bedroom, watched her stand in the center of the kitchen looking at the layout, watched her open the back door and step onto the small deck and look at the yard for a long time. Noah was in the carrier on Marco's chest, facing outward, looking at everything with the systematic intensity of a person cataloging a new world. Elena came back inside. She leaned against the kitchen counter and looked at him. "It needs work," she said. "I know." "The deck railing is loose. The kitchen is 20 years out of date. That third bedroom conversion—" She stopped. "It's not a third bedroom. It's a large closet with aspirations." "I know all of that," he said. "But the yard is good," she said. "The yard is really good." He nodded. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Noah, who was looking at the kitchen window with his focused, new-person gaze, one hand wrapped around Marco's index finger in the automatic grip that had not yet become voluntary but would. "David asked me again," she said, "last week, before everything with Bellucci. He asked me for my answer." Marco kept his face still. "What did you tell him?" he said. "I told him I needed more time." She looked at the window. He was gracious about it. He's a gracious man." She said it without irony, with the honest specificity of someone giving credit where it was accurate. "He said he understood. He said he'd wait." "And now," Marco said. She looked back at him. "I called him yesterday," she said. "I told him no." The kitchen was quiet around that. "Elena, don't," she said. Not harshly. "Don't say you're sorry, and don't say thank you, and don't say it means anything beyond what it actually means, which is that I made a decision based on where I actually am." She pushed off the counter. He deserved an honest answer, and I gave him one. That's all that is. Okay, Marco said. It doesn't mean... She stopped, looked at Noah. It doesn't settle everything, Marco. There's a lot of ground between where we are and wherever this goes. I'm not... She seemed to be choosing words with real care. I'm not standing in this kitchen making you a promise. I know, he said. I'm just standing in this kitchen, she said. He looked at her. In the morning light, in the empty house, with their son between them and the overgrown yard outside, and the whole unresolved, complicated, real thing that they were standing in the middle of. And he thought about the photograph that had appeared on his phone 2 months ago, the one that had loaded and been deleted and started all of this. Elena in a hospital room looking down at something in her arms. My little miracle. He thought about the 4 seconds he'd had to look at it before it disappeared. He thought about how much had changed because of 4 seconds. I'm standing in this kitchen too, he said. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she pushed off the counter and walked past him through the kitchen door and out onto the deck. And he followed. And they stood in the yard in the October morning, with Noah looking at the fir trees and the creek sound coming from somewhere beyond the green belt, and the city moving through its Saturday all around them, invisible and irrelevant. The federal warrants for Bellucci came through on a Tuesday, 6 weeks after the warehouse. Marco heard about it from Hargrove, who heard about it through the procedural channels that the agreement had established. Carrillo had moved fast. Marco had told Dante he would, and he had. The information Marco had provided was specific enough and current enough to accelerate a case that had been building for 4 years into something actionable in 6 weeks. Bellucci was arrested at his restaurant in Sodo at 7:30 in the morning, which was the kind of timing that was chosen for its precision. A man taken at a moment he didn't expect, before the machinery of his day could assemble the kind of protection that money and lawyers and organizational infrastructure could provide. The Kowalski arrest came 2 days later, in Portland. Marco read about both in the news the way any person read the news, sitting at a kitchen table with coffee, in the morning, with the ordinary life of the house around him. He'd been in the Fremont house for 3 weeks by then. The deck railing had been repaired. The kitchen renovation was scheduled for February. The large closet with aspirations had been assessed by a contractor who said the wall could come out without structural consequence, and the conversion would take 10 days. He read the news and drank his coffee and thought about the weight of the thing he was reading, not just as outcome, but as process, as the accumulated consequence of 100 decisions moving through a system and producing this. He thought about Dante in the Tacoma office. He thought about Carver. Carver had been released 2 weeks after the warehouse, with conditions, specific documented conditions that Hargrove had structured and that Carver had signed, conditions that were not punitive in the way the organization would once have been punitive, but that were real enough to constitute consequence. A young man given a second chance he had not earned in a world that did not typically provide them. Marco wasn't sure how he felt about that. He'd made the decision and he would carry it, but he wasn't sure how he felt about it, and he didn't try to resolve the feeling into something cleaner than it was. That was new. The willingness to let things stay at their actual resolution instead of forcing them into shapes that were easier to hold. He was learning that. The day Noah took his first steps was a Saturday in late November. They were in the backyard. The yard that had been overgrown was now cleared, the grass cut. The beds along the fence line turned for spring planting. Elena had brought a blanket and spread it on the grass and set Noah on it, and they were sitting on the deck steps with coffee, not talking specifically, just present in the particular way that they'd developed over the preceding months, comfortable in the same space, not requiring it to be more than it was. Noah had been pulling himself to standing for 2 weeks. His legs had the specific concentrated wobble of a person learning to trust a new technology. He would pull up on something, the edge of the blanket, a fist of grass, and stand for a moment with the expression of someone who had achieved something and was not yet sure what to do with the achievement. Then he would sit down, deliberately, and start again. On this particular Saturday morning, he pulled himself up using a fold of the blanket and stood, and then, without holding anything, took 2 steps toward Marco on the deck steps, not toward Elena, toward Marco. The first step was committed. The second was optimistic. The third was where gravity won, and Noah sat down on the grass with the startled expression of a person for whom the outcome was unexpected. Then he looked up at Marco with an expression that was equal parts accusation and satisfaction. Marco was off the steps before he'd made the decision to move. He was crouched in the grass in front of his son, and his hands were out and his throat was doing the thing again, the thing that made speaking temporarily complicated. And Noah looked at him with the wide, dark eyes that were Marco's eyes, and reached up with both hands in the gesture that was unmistakable and universal and required no translation. Marco picked him up. He held him with both hands under the arms and lifted him to eye level, and looked at his son's face, and Noah looked back with complete equanimity, the expression of a person who had done something difficult and was prepared to do it again. Elena had come off the steps too. She was standing behind Marco, and when he turned she was closer than the managed distance they'd been maintaining, and her expression was the unguarded one, the one that appeared when she wasn't performing any version of herself and was just there, in the moment, without the layer of careful management between her face and the world. "He went to you," she said. Her voice was soft. "He fell," Marco said. "He went to you first," she said. 2 steps. He chose the direction. Marco looked at his son. Noah reached up and grabbed Marco's lower lip with one hand, which was apparently the most interesting object in the yard, and Marco let him, and the absurdity of it, the sheer, unremarkable, ordinary absurdity of standing in a backyard in Fremont on a November morning with his son's hand on his face, was the most fully alive he had felt in as long as he could remember. "Come here," Elena said. She said it quietly. Not to Noah. He turned. She was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen before. Not the attorney's assessment, not the exhausted mother, not the careful management of proximity and hope and risk. Something that had come through all of those things and out the other side. She stepped forward and put her hand against his face the way she'd done in the doorway of the safe house the night of the warehouse. The same gesture, the same specific tenderness of a woman confirming that something real was still standing. He put his free hand over hers. They stood in the yard like that for a moment, with Noah between them, and the fir trees behind the green belt, and the creek somewhere out of sight, and the city going about its Saturday in all directions. "I'm not scared anymore," Elena said. He looked at her. "I'm still not making you a promise," she said. "I'm not—" She almost smiled. "I'm not standing in this yard declaring anything." "I know," he said. "But I'm not scared," she said, "and that's different from where I was." He nodded. She dropped her hand, stepped back, looked at Noah. "He's going to try again," she said. "He's got the face." Noah did have the face, the expression of concentrated intention that Marco had seen on him before, the expression that meant he'd identified a problem and was preparing to apply himself to it. Marco set him down on the grass. Noah grabbed a fist of the blanket, pulled himself to standing, let go, and stood for a full 3 seconds on his own, looking at the world from the new perspective of vertical. Then he took a step. Then another. 3 this time before he sat down. He looked up at Marco, then at Elena. His expression was not triumphant. It was simply the expression of a person who had done what they intended to do and would do it again, and did not require acknowledgement to understand that it was real. Marco sat down on the blanket beside his son. Elena sat on his other side. Noah pulled himself up again. The creek ran somewhere in the trees. The city held its Saturday around them. The November light came down clean and honest over a backyard in Fremont, and somewhere across the city, the machinery of old things continued to grind itself down into pieces that would be accounted for and documented and settled. And somewhere in Tacoma, a legitimate business was running its Tuesday with a new operational manager, and in an office in the federal building downtown, a case was being built from specific information provided by a man who had made the most expensive decision of his life and was sitting on a blanket in his backyard watching his son walk. Marco looked at Elena. She was watching Noah. Her profile in the November light was the same profile he'd looked at across a courtroom 14 months ago. The same certainty in the line of it, the same quality of a person who had decided exactly what they believed and arranged themselves around it. She turned, caught him looking. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. She studied him for a moment, then she looked back at Noah. "You're going to need to childproof that deck railing," she said. "The repair is fine, but the spacing between the rails is too wide. He'll put his head through it." "I'll call the contractor Monday," he said. "And the kitchen renovation." She paused. "The cabinet height." If you're going with the standard uppers, the bottom shelf is going to be reachable in about 18 months. You want latches on everything below counter level before that. I'll add it to the scope, he said. She nodded, apparently satisfied. She reached over and adjusted the fold of the blanket near Noah's feet without looking at it, the automatic calibration of a person for whom the small adjustments had become reflex. I might stay for dinner, she said, not looking at him, looking at Noah. Marco said nothing for a moment. I was going to cook, he said. I've been practicing. She turned. The almost smile was closer to actual this time. You've been practicing cooking, she said. Don't, he said. I'm not saying anything, she said. You're saying something, he said. I'm saying I might stay for dinner, she said. Noah sat down on the blanket, looked at both of them, looked at the trees, made a sound that was not a word yet but was headed toward becoming one, a specific vocalization that he'd been developing for 2 weeks, that Elena said was going to be either more or no, depending on which he figured out first. Marco looked at his son. He thought about a glass of scotch poured down a sink at the beginning of this, and a photograph that had loaded and been deleted, and a woman who had survived his world without him and built something real in the surviving. He thought about what it had cost to get here. Not just him, all of it, all of them. And he didn't minimize the cost, he let it be what it was. The real and specific price of 20 years and the choices inside them. Then he looked at the yard, at the trees, at Elena beside him on the blanket, at Noah pulling himself to standing one more time, legs wobbling, concentrating with every cell of his small, determined body. Letting go. Standing. Marco leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and watched his son take the next step into the world. It held.